In this program, we'll introduce you to the radial arm saw. We will describe all the components and controls and how they affect what operations can be performed on the saw. We've included some helpful safety information and a few demonstrations to show how you can get accurate and consistent results from this versatile woodshop tool. The radial arm saw is a stationary saw used for a variety of cuts, including crosscuts, datos, miters, and in certain industrial applications for ripping. When performing most cutting operations with the radial arm saw, the operator draws the motor and saw blade assembly across stock, which is held stationary. By adding attachments, it's possible to adapt the radial arm saw for drilling, sanding, and planing, but in most shops, the setup times make these attachments impractical. Radial arm saws are most often mounted permanently in wood shops and cabinet shops and are used for basic cross-cutting and cabinet joinery work. But the latest generation of light-duty saws and portable units are starting to appear at construction sites as well. The radial arm saw is a deceptively dangerous tool when used carelessly or when it's not properly adjusted and set up. The blade spins at great speeds and is often exposed during operations, and there's a tendency for the blade to pull itself through the wood and towards the operator. So safety is extremely important. We'll cover more on this later. Now let's take a few minutes to become familiar with all the parts and controls of the radial arm saw. In most shops, the radial arm saw is located in the middle of a long, level workbench to allow for cutting long pieces of stock. In the middle of this bench is the base, which is usually a metal structure or heavy wooden cabinet. This base supports the table, which has a column securely bolted at its rear. The fence is a straight-edged stop, running the width of the tabletop and often the length of the entire workbench. Stock is placed firmly against the fence and held in place during most cutting operations. At the top of the column, a cantilevered arm is attached, the radial arm from which the saw gets its name. A swiveling yoke rides along a track in the arm and holds the motor assembly. The handle for drawing the saw blade through the stock is attached to this yoke. The saw guard is mounted to the motor assembly to protect you from the saw blade. Usually there is an upper guard which is fixed while a lower guard moves up and down to accommodate stock as it's cut. The guard also directs the sawdust away from the operator and into a dust collection system. An anti-kickback lever is sometimes attached to the saw guard, but only functions during ripping operations. When the saw is not used for ripping, this part is either removed or raised up out of the way. The operational controls of the radial arm saw are designed to adjust the height and angle of the saw blade and to securely lock the selected settings for repetitive operations. The crank or elevating arm is used to raise and lower the column to alter the depth the blade will cut into the stock. The arm can be rotated or pivoted on the column and secured in position for making miter cuts. The arm lock is used to lock the arm in miter position. The bevel locking lever or swivel lever allows the motor and saw assembly to be tipped side to side in relation to the tabletop for making bevel cuts. Screw knobs or locking levers are used to secure the angle settings. Miter and bevel scales are helpful in determining the angles of cuts, but should not be relied on for making very accurate cuts. Positive stops are located at often used positions such as 45 or 90 degrees, but again check the angle with scrap material before cutting valuable stock. The yoke clamp and lever are used only when setting up the saw for ripping. Most radial arm saws have a locking on-off switch with a removable key to prevent unauthorized operation of the saw. The on button is usually surrounded by a protective shield so that it can be pressed only from directly in front of the saw. The off button protrudes out from the surface, and this makes it easy to stop the saw quickly from any angle or in an emergency situation. Continuous use of the radial arm saw may trip the overload protection system. This can also happen when the saw motor is overloaded or jammed. The reset button is used to reset the system and begin operations again. But be sure to let the motor cool down sufficiently and take precautions to prevent the problem from occurring again. Radial arm saws are usually classified by their size, which is a combination of the blade size and the horsepower rating. Most wood shops have radial arm saws with blade sizes of 10 to 12 inches with power ratings of 2 to 4 horsepower. This translates to approximately 10 to 15 amps for 110-volt motors. Sizes can vary from 7¼ inch blades up to industrial units with 22-inch blades or even larger. Two more components for determining the size and capability of the radial arm saw are often overlooked. They are the maximum depth of the cut and maximum width of cut when the saw is set up for a 90-degree crosscut. The maximum depth of cut, or maximum thickness of stock that can be cut in one pass, ranges from 2 to 3 inches. The maximum width of cut, or the reach of the arm, usually ranges from 12 to 15 inches. Attachments can be added to extend the arm for wider cuts, but are seldom seen in most shops. It will take practice to become familiar with the saw's ability to cut stocks in various widths and thicknesses. Use extreme caution and proceed slowly until you gain this practical knowledge. Radial arm saws use the same basic circular saw blades that are used on table saws. Most shops have an assortment of blades including a rip blade, a crosscut blade, a general-purpose combination blade, and a set of dado blades. Carbide-tipped blades stay sharp longest and give the best all-around performance. Use sharp and true blades and match the blade to the job. Inspect the teeth closely before each use and test for sharpness by dragging your fingernail across the edge of the tooth. If a thin chip of your nail peels off easily, the blade is sharp. Keep your blades clean. A blade that's covered with pitch will slow down the saw and cause binding problems. Be sure the arbor size of the blade matches the saw. Blades are easily damaged and dulled, so store them properly. Since the radial arm saw is often used for various cross-cutting procedures, a carbide-tipped combination blade is used the most. But because the saw cuts along a straight path, the set of the saw teeth can generally be a little smaller. This will help to give a smoother cut with less tear out. This cut-off blade has many more teeth with a special planer tooth pattern, which means it will give cuts so smooth they appear to have been planed. Dado blade sets consist of 2 combination-type blades and a set of chipper blades of various thickness. By using the 2 outer blades and at least 1 chipper blade, the width of the dado cut can be precisely selected. To make fine adjustments to the width of the cut, you can use paper shims. Another type of dado blade is the adjustable dado cutter head, which is rotated for various thickness settings. This blade will cause a little bit more vibration during cutting. But for light-duty operations, the adjustable dado is adequate and a bit easier to set up. We will give a more detailed explanation of how to use dado blades later. All of the general safety rules for working in a wood shop hold true for operating the radial arm saw. Wear the proper clothing and protective gear. The radial arm saw often throws off waste and debris with violent force, so the use of protective eye gear is especially important. Work in a well-lit area and support the work properly. Always make sure the power is disconnected or the on-off safety key is removed before changing blades or making adjustments to the saw. Power cords and extension cables should be carefully selected to match the amperage rating of the saw. Undersized electrical cords can rob the saw of its power and shorten the life of the motor. Here are a few additional safety rules to keep in mind when you're using a radial arm saw. Always keep the guard in place. The blade on a radial arm saw is fully exposed, so the first rule is to always keep the guard in place during all cutting operations. Do not rip with the radial arm saw. The second safety rule is do not rip with the radial saw. For the purpose of school shops, all ripping operations should be done on the table saw. Use the proper blade for each job. Select the proper blade for the work to be done. In most cases, a combination blade will be adequate for all cross-cutting operations. The blade should be sharp, true, and clean for best results. Adjust the height and angle before each operation. Adjust the saw height properly depending on the project needs. For crosscuts, the blade should descend into the top surface of the table approximately 1/16 inch. Secure all clamps and locks. Be sure all clamps and locking devices are tightly set and properly positioned before you begin cutting operations. Position the stock properly. To position the stock properly, make sure it's tight against the fence. If you're cutting long pieces of stock, support both ends at the same level as the tabletop. Position yourself properly. It's very important to position yourself properly when using the radial arm saw. In most cases, you should stand facing the saw and to the right of the path of the blade. This arrangement will help prevent the blade from cutting your hand because the motor will hit your hand first. Maintain a 6-inch safety margin. Maintain a 6-inch margin of safety around the path of the saw blade. The saw blade on a radial arm saw moves through the material, so you must keep clear not only of the blade itself, but also the entire length of the blade's path. Keep your fingers at least 6 inches away from the saw and its path at all times. Make sure the blade is clear before starting the saw. Make sure the blade is clear before you start up the saw. All tools and wood should be removed, and make sure the saw head or motor is pushed all the way back. Do not start the saw when the blade is touching the stock. Grasp the handle firmly before you turn it on to be sure it stays clear as the motor comes up to speed. Anticipate and prevent crawling. A radial arm saw has the tendency to pull itself into the stock. This is called crawling. It can be prevented by stiff arming as you firmly pull the blade through the stock. It may take quite some time before you feel confident with this technique. The most common causes for a radial arm saw to crawl are cutting too fast, using a dull blade, or cutting wood with knots or paint. And of course, you should be using a sharp blade. Dull blades can cause a problem with crawling even in smooth-grained wood. Always keep your body away from the rotating blade when you're done. When the cut has been made, turn the power off and allow the blade to come to a complete stop before removing scrap or making additional saw adjustments. Never reach behind the blade while it's moving. Return the saw to the rear of the table. Always return the saw to the rear of the table after you've completed the cut. Never leave the saw while it's running. Never leave the machine before the blade has come to a complete stop. Maintain a clean work area. Keep the table clean and free of excess dust or scrap, but always wait until after the blade has stopped moving to remove waste and sawdust. In this section of the program, we'll demonstrate a few of the more common operating procedures for cutting with a radial arm saw. We'll cover crosscuts, angle or bevel cuts, and dado cuts. To make an accurate crosscut, start by laying out and marking your stock piece carefully. Mark which side is waste so you can make sure the saw kerf ends up where you want it. Remove the on-off key and adjust the motor assembly so that it's at a right angle to the tabletop. Lock it in position with the bevel locking lever. Adjust the arm so that the saw is at 0 position. This should place the saw at a right angle to the fence. Turn the crank or elevating arm until the teeth of the blade cut into the top surface of the table about 1/16 inch. There will normally be a slot already cut into the table at common angles. Pull the saw along the arm to be sure it will travel freely. Place the stock on the table up against the fence. Line up your mark in the path of the saw blade. Make sure the stock is held firmly against the fence. Position yourself properly and maintain a safety margin of at least 6 inches from the path of the saw blade. Be sure the saw blade is not in contact with the stock. Grasp the handle and turn the power on. Let the saw come up to full speed. Pull the handle of the saw firmly but slowly through the wood. Remember to use the stiff arm technique to prevent crawling. Try not to pull the arm out of square as you cut. When the cut is complete, return the saw back to the rear position behind the fence and turn it off. Wait until the saw comes to a complete stop before checking your cut and making any adjustments. If the cut is satisfactory, clean up any scrap or sawdust. To make a miter crosscut, follow the same basic steps, except you'll have to position the arm at an angle to the fence before you lock the arm into position. Double check for proper elevation and for free travel along the arm for the full width of cut. Maintain the proper safety margin and make the cut. To make a bevel cut, loosen the bevel locking lever and rotate the motor assembly to the proper angle in relation to the tabletop. Tighten the lever. Position the arm for the proper angle relative to the fence. Tighten the arm lock. Mark your stock and position it against the fence. Start the saw and pull it through the stock. Return the saw to the back position, then turn it off. Let the motor come to a complete stop and check your work. It is possible to do compound cuts by altering the miter angle at the same time you tilt the bevel angle of the saw. Remember that this will take practice to set up the saw accurately, and you'll have to make test cuts before you can get precise results. But the radial arm saw is one of the only tools that will enable you to get consistent cuts of this nature. The radial arm saw is especially useful for cutting rabbets or dados, for doing joinery work and cabinet making. We gave you a brief introduction to the two types of dado blades earlier. To set up dados of various widths, you can either stack up separate dado blade assemblies, or you can use an adjustable blade, which is sometimes called a wobble dado blade. Be sure the power is disconnected before changing or adjusting blades. Remove the guard and blade and store the blade properly. If you use separate dado blades, stack them carefully with chipper blades distributed evenly around the outer blades. This will help prevent excessive vibration. Make sure all the teeth are oriented in the proper direction of rotation. Chipper blades must have their teeth placed in the gullet of the outer blades so they'll stack up properly. Try to tighten the blades consistently each time they're mounted, since this can alter the thickness of the cut slightly. If you use an adjustable blade, rotate the assembly until the proper width is achieved. Be sure to tighten the screws of the assembly before you mount it on the saw. Most adjustable dado sets have an inner sleeve. Don't forget this when you mount the blade. Dado blades have a greater tendency to cause the saw to crawl into your stock. If your saw permits the use of the saw guard during dado cuts, reinstall the guard. If the guard will remain off during dado work, be extra careful and increase the margin of safety. Mark the face of the stock for the dado cut. It's a good idea to mark some scrap stock that's the same dimension of the stock, so you can make some trial cuts and fine-tune your settings before cutting valuable stock. Place the dado blades on the saw shaft and tighten the arbor nut. Set up the saw for the proper angle of cut. Use the elevating arm to bring the dado blade down until it touches the top surface of the stock. Then lower it to the proper depth for your cut. Check all locking levers. When you're ready to make the cut, hold the stock firmly against the fence and start the saw. Remember to maintain an extra margin of safety when cutting with dado blades. Pull the saw across your stock, but go slowly and keep your stiff arm position. Cutting with a dado blade will cause more of a problem with crawling, since there are more teeth cutting out a larger volume of material. It might be safer to remove a small amount at a time and get the full depth cut with successive passes. 3/8 of an inch is about the most you can remove in one pass. By removing a little at a time, you can just about eliminate tear out, which can be a problem when cutting dados. It will take lots of practice and test cuts to become proficient at doing precision dado cuts with a radial arm saw, but the results are well worth the time and the effort. Before we close this program, let's take a minute to review the basic safety rules for operating the radial arm saw. Always keep the guard in place. Do not rip with the radial arm saw. Use the proper blade for each job. Adjust the height and angle before each operation. Secure all clamps and locks. Position the stock properly. Position yourself properly. Maintain a 6-inch safety margin. Make sure the blade is clear before starting the saw. Anticipate and prevent crawling. Always keep your body away from the rotating blade. Return the saw to the rear of the table when you're done. Never leave the saw while it's running. And maintain a clean work area. Take the time to practice and develop your skills on the Radial arm saw, and you'll be rewarded with an expanded ability to construct quality woodworking projects. And with the right attitude, you can make your shop a safer place to work at the same time.